Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Ignition Time. Russia has invaded the Ukraine. In fact, one of my neighbors actually, his family is originally from Ukraine, and I've decided to pray for them tonight because I'm just hoping that the humanitarian crisis can be minimized. Unfortunately, people will die and people are dying as a result of this invasion. And I can tell you that the whole thing is unfortunately a humanitarian tragedy because of all the games the psycho dictator Putin plays and all his attempts to try and recapture quote unquote Russia's glory on the world stage. Welcome to this episode of Ignition Time, everyone. This episode is based on this article on your screen from Fox Business. The Ukraine-Russia conflict could push inflation to 10% as the invasion begins. In fact, it has already begun. This Russia-Ukraine crisis could push oil prices to $120 a barrel, which means pain for us at the gas pump. In this episode of Ignition Time, I'll cover how the Russia-Ukraine conflict will impact your wallet. In fact, inflation is already at the highest level in 4 decades, and Russia's attack on Ukraine could actually make things even worse. That's because oil is already above $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014, and some prices jumped as high as $105 after Russia announced the attack on Ukraine. So this entire war in Europe, which by the way has shattered 3 decades of peace in Europe, could ultimately cause oil prices to surge as high as 20% to $120 a barrel, which by the way is good for Putin because he controls Russia's oil reserves. And if that were to happen, consumer prices in the US could surge above 10% on an annual basis, which means things are going to get more expensive for us in every way, shape, or form. Everything is going to start to become more expensive on top of all the casualties. And this really is a tragedy of this entire situation. And again, folks, I hope that the humanitarian tragedy is minimized, but unfortunately, there's an economic tragedy as well. According to RSM chief economist Joe Brusalis, the war in Europe could lead to oil prices going as high as $120 a barrel. In fact, Brusalis said this: the potential for a broader energy shock to the global and US economies should Russia invade Ukraine, by the way, they've already invaded Ukraine, has added to a combustible mix of factors that is causing inflation to accelerate in the United States and abroad. So I want our viewers and subscribers to know that after the Middle East, Russia is the world's second largest producer of both oil and natural gas, and a conflict or sanctions could disrupt the oil market even further at a time when demand is exceeding supply. So what is happening here, folks, is that Germany has already imposed sanctions on Russia. And in fact, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has threatened that any foreign country attempting to interfere will be hit with consequences you have never seen, which, by the way, is a reference to the nuclear arsenal that Moscow possesses. In fact, America and Europe also fear that Russia may retaliate against sanctions by cutting off the supply of oil and natural gas that flows from Moscow to Europe. Therefore, that will send prices even higher. So, folks, this is a very, very uncertain, this is a very, very dangerous situation. The US and its NATO allies, despite all this, have shown no indication that they want to join a war against Russia. In fact, JP Morgan Chase economists have warned that any disruption to Russia's oil supplies could easily send oil to $120 a barrel. So what does all of this mean to you, the American consumer? What is the bottom line? Well, folks, we as American citizens are already facing high prices when we go get gas. In fact, a gallon of gas on average cost $3.51 nationwide, up from $2.63 a year ago. In fact, in California, gas prices are well above $4 a gallon. In fact, for months, the prices of all kinds of energy, gasoline, diesel fuel, natural gas, oil, and more have been a major driver behind inflation, which, by the way, surged to 7.5% in January, which is the highest level since 1982. Energy costs have climbed 27% over the past year, partly due to lopsided supply and demand. Consumers are traveling more, but the supply side has simply not kept up with demand. This creates a very unique situation in which the supply is not able to keep up with demand. And on top of that, if the gas supplies from Russia are somehow curtailed or constricted because of sanctions, this means that overall everything will start to become even more expensive. And this creates unforeseen challenges that unfortunately we may or may not be prepared for. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. This is a very challenging time for us as a country, even though the Russia-Ukraine crisis does not directly impact us because geographically we are thousands and thousands of miles away. This, after all, is happening in a different continent. But not only is there a humanitarian crisis to this, unfortunately people will die, but this will also lead to gas prices going up and lead to all kinds of unimaginable burdens, economic, financial, emotional burdens for Americans all over the country. In fact, by extension, I would say to all of Europe, because Europe is now going to face added gas prices. Europe is going to face higher oil prices if Moscow chooses to cut off the supply of natural gas and oil to the rest of Europe, which Europe is highly dependent on, which, by the way, makes sense because that is one of the main reasons why Europe and America are not sending troops to fight Russia. Nobody wants a full-scale war. I do not think there will be a full-scale war. I think that both sides, meaning the West and Europe, are going to huff and puff with Russia, and hopefully at some point this situation should resolve itself. Now, I don't want you to think that Russia will just walk away from Ukraine. Unfortunately, this does create broader complications because China is watching. And if China notices that America and Europe are not, are essentially giving Putin a slap on the wrist, then China may decide to invade Taiwan. This is essentially a litmus test, if you will, for American leadership and European leadership to see how we react while playing a balancing act with Russia, because the world is dependent on the second largest producer of oil and natural gas, and that is Russia after the Middle East. And that is a complicated part of this equation. Let me know where you stand in the comment section below. Please click like, please click subscribe, please enable notifications. Follow me on Twitter. This right here is my Twitter feed. My Twitter handle is ignition_time. That's ignition_time. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, please click like, please click subscribe, please enable notifications. I appreciate you. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next episode of Ignition Time. Take care. Bye.